This is NFA Talk, the show that talks about guns and gun rights, keeping you up to date with what's currently going on, from the newest guns, promotions, and events, plus how we're lobbying for your rights.
All right, it's time for another episode of NFA Talk. Good evening, I'm your host, Jordan Vandenhoff. Joining me tonight, we have Sheldon Clare, our national president. We have Charles Zach, our man in Ottawa, our in-house lobbyist. And for the first time tonight, joining us, Jerrold Lundgard. Jerrold is our Alberta director. Jerrold, thank you for being here. And guys, you're still muted. Let's take those mics off of mute.
Hello, everybody.
Perfect.
Hello. Hi, Jerrold.
So,
good to see you here.
Jerrold, it's the first time on the show. We're happy to have you. And why don't we tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
70 years old, born and raised in Alberta. Been a gun owner for 60 of those 70 years, and being a law-abiding citizen for as long as I can remember. And I'm with the NFA. I'm the Alberta director, and I'm working within the law to change the law.
Right. So you've been a long time firearms rights advocate, and you have your views on things, and one of your favorite things is trying to remove Section 91 out of the criminal code. Why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Okay, Section 91 of the criminal code in 1995, the Alan Rock Jean Chrétien government passed Bill C-68 into force. And what they did was they amended the criminal code, and for the first time ever, possession of firearms became a criminal code offense. When they passed that law, when they made firearms illegal to possess, they had a problem. Everybody had guns. So they created a temporary solution. They created the gun license. The gun license is a temporary document that allows you to possess some guns in some places. Now, your temporary license expires after 5 years. You have to renew it. You have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to get it. Those hoops are hard to find. You have to get the Canadian Firearm Safety course. There's a limited number of instructors across Canada. The federal government tells us there's enough. There aren't. If it was truly about safety, this course would be in the schools. It isn't. The safety course was instituted originally by Kim Campbell under the conservative government of Stephen Harper in about 1991, 1992. It became mandatory for first-time gun owners to get that safety course before they could get a firearms acquisition certificate. The firearms acquisition certificate was different from the gun license in that it allowed possession, or it allowed purchase of a firearm without a criminal code offense associated with it. If you had your FAC, you could purchase a gun. It wasn't a crime. If you didn't have your FAC, it was a crime to take possession of a gun, buy, borrow, find in the woods. You became an instant criminal. Just remember, there's no victim there. It's taking possession of property. And taking possession of property became a criminal code offense in 1976 under the Ron Bassford, Pierre Trudeau government. Fast forward to 1998, they outlawed guns. They changed the word taking possession of a firearm, and they just changed it to possession. Possession of all firearms in Canada is a criminal code offense. Your firearms license is a defense against conviction, but only for some guns, hunting guns. Not there's other offenses out there for handguns. If you take the handgun to the wrong place, to a place where you're not approved, you can end up facing a criminal code conviction, forfeiture of all your firearms, all your ammunition, and all your accessories. And that's new since, I believe, Bill C-21, but I'm not. It's really hard to keep up with the changes in the firearms law. One of the problems that we have, or one of the problems the firearms laws have, is that there's no victim. There's no violence. There's no harm to the public. There's no harm to another individual. There's no theft. There's no robbery, no threat, no intimidation. It's mere possession of an object. I bought my first gun in 1964 when I was 13 years old. I used my summer's wages to buy it. Gun control at that time was the manager of the hardware store saying, "Who's your dad?" And when he found out, he took my money and gave me a receipt, a cash register receipt for the gun. He also threw in a box of 12-gauge shotgun shells. Okay. The guns in the hardware store were stored on a shelf in the back. No security, no locks. The ammunition was stored just below the guns. No security, no locks. No one picked up a gun and loaded it and fired it in the store. No one robbed stores. The crime rate in 1964 was extremely low. All of a sudden, as the baby boomers are aging, the crime rate since 1976, the homicide rate has been dropping. And it's been dropping in a stable trend. And the points in time when the firearms laws were introduced have not changed the slope of that drop. When in 1998, when the mandatory gun licensing for possession of a firearm came into force, and a whole bunch of people, probably 100,000, maybe 200,000, gave up their firearms, there was no decline or no change in the homicide rate. When gun registration came in 1998, there was no decline in the homicide rate with firearms or the overall homicide rate. There wasn't even substitution. And it was studied by a fellow by the name of Kalen Langman, who looked very carefully at all the homicides between 1974 and 1982. And he discovered that no restrictions on firearms owners or firearms has had any influence at all on the homicide rate. Now, the other issue is in 1974, there were about 900 people in Canada under court-ordered firearms possession prohibitions. That is, they came into the court and they got a firearms possession prohibition. Either they got a conditional discharge with the prohibition, they got a conviction and release with the prohibition, or they went to jail. But they had a 5-year firearms prohibition. Believe it or not, until the present, that number rose almost exponentially until at present. We have over 435,000, maybe 450,000 Canadians now at this point in time who have firearms possession prohibitions ordered by the court. There has been no change in the firearms homicide rate in Canada associated with that. And from what I read in the newspapers about gangsters and gangs being found in possession of firearms and being charged with a firearms offense for being in possession of a firearm, even though they had a firearms prohibition, the firearms prohibitions are not working to reduce crime. The bottom line, the problem is criminals and people with a criminal mind who are willing to harm others, who are willing to steal, who are willing to threaten and willing to intimidate. Firearms don't cause that. What causes that are people with criminal minds, and we're not dealing with those minds. Instead, we have a federal government that is disparaging and diminishing and demeaning law-abiding gun owners. Guys like me, who are 70 years old, own guns over their life, all of their lives, and have never done anything with a firearm that would warrant harm to another person or be considered vandalism.
Well, and the part of the problem too here, Jerrold, is that self-defense is considered the idea of promoting harm. So if you say you're even if you're packing a knife for self-defense, that's construed in the criminal code as showing intent of causing harm. So,
May I remind you, Sheldon? May I remind you?
Yep.
Our government agents, the RCMP, customs officers, conservation officers, they all get to carry a firearm and many other means of self-defense. And if self-defense wasn't standard and normal and acceptable, government agents like the police would not be allowed to carry firearms.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
How is a government employee, how is their life worth defending more than your life or my life or the life of my family?
Well, you can get
Two
permits to
standards.
carry. I mean, for wilderness carry, it's a possibility in some provinces at least. And maybe now that you have Terry Bryant as your CFO in Alberta, there may be a little bit more opening up of that area. But there's very much a philosophy in successive governments that they don't want people to defend themselves with a firearm. They don't want people to have firearms. And with a lot of other things that are going on right now, they really want to get the guns. You know, the OIC is a symptom of that. Subsequent tabled legislation, which died on the order paper C-21, that's a symptom of that. And, you know, we're seeing more and more lack of trust of citizens by governments and much more attempts to be authoritarian and directive to citizens. And part of that is all about getting the guns away from us. It's not anything but civil disarmament.
You know, what's interesting, what you just said, and I just want to talk to Jerrold's point, and you're right on. You know, there's kind of a shift away from, you know, trusting civilians with firearms and allowing the bigger government to be armed now. You know, we're going into the field in the next couple of weeks. Some people are already hunting. People should know that the conservation officers, I know in Ontario, they've just been, given so-called military assault rifles. I'm assuming for self-defense. It's certainly not for hunting, according to Trudeau. So, you know, they're getting all these self-defense guns, as they say it, but we're not allowed to have them. The hypocrisy of that speaks loud and clear.
Well, I want to point out, and it's very scary, because the government says these weapons are designed to kill the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time, so the citizens can't have them, but all our government agents are going to be getting them. So
exactly.
Should we be worried here?
It's also not true that they're designed to kill people in a short amount of time. That's absolutely nonsense.
It's just
a gun
fear-mongering,
control,
right?
Yeah, it's fear-mongering by gun grabbers. The fact of the matter is all firearms pretty much work the same. They involve a projectile, a propellant, some sort of a receiver to force the charge, and a barrel to drive the projectile down to a particular target. And all firearms pretty much work in that fashion. Some firearms have capacity to have more ammunition. Some firearms are specialists in particular purposes. But the key active ingredient in a problem when a firearm is misused or used for ill intent is the person holding it. The firearm by itself is not any arbiter of what happens that makes things bad or worse or anything else. It's all about the person. So firearms control legislation does not prevent bad behavior. Never has, never will.
You know, one thing that Jerrold touched on too was, the abuse of the criminal code. And I know, Dreiger's ruled, and I'm giving you a segue here, Jerrold. You'd love talking about that, but I think it's a point that we should reiterate right now, because it shows where we're sliding into. The criminal code was never meant to, address administrative transgressions. It was meant for more criminal things. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit more, Jerrold.
The bottom line, Dreiger's rule is the criminal code is there to cure an ill in society, not to create a mischief. In 1999, with the passage of Bill C-68 and the criminalization of possession of firearms, at the time, the Liberal Party criminalized around 4.5 million gun owners. Now, the government estimates are way lower than that, mostly because they love to point out the numbers that showed high compliance. But in reality, all of the surveys that they've done show about a 20-to-1 ratio of handguns, restricted firearms, to long guns in homes in Canada. In 1995-96, there were about 520,000 individuals in Canada who were in possession of a restricted firearm certificate. And that was either one or more restricted firearms certificates. If you take 520,000 folks, each having one handgun, and you multiply that by 20, that is 10 million households that had firearms in them. That's a possible 10 million gun owners. And all of that 20-to-1 ratio existed in all the surveys. Oh.
Nice. Speaking of handguns and being in
all you
being
guys
resident.
all you guys with the pea shooters, right?
Yeah, one up on us again there, Jordan.
Anyway,
great point, Jerrold, for sure.
Boys.
The bottom line, we have to take the nonviolent, non-victim administrative infractions out of the criminal code. And that's not just firearms infractions, it's all property infractions. You shouldn't go to jail for the property that you purchased and paid tax on, and you purchased with tax paid money, and you used a government document to allow the purchase. And that's a betrayal. Now, on the Liberal Party, when people say you can't trust the Liberal Party is doing exactly as they promised. They promised they were going to take the guns away. In 2006, I believe Paul Martin promised that he was going to take all the handguns away. He lost an election. 2 million licensed gun owners said, hey, you're not going to do that. And then Mr. Stephen Harper dropped the ball by removing just the long gun registry from the criminal code, but he didn't remove the license from the criminal code. What the Liberals have done is they've created criminal acts that before 1995 were common everyday occurrences. Travel with a firearm, storage of a firearm. There was no decrease in accidents when Kim Campbell put the mandatory firearm safety course for first-time buyers in place. That was in 1992. Gary Mauser did research on that. He was looking for a reduction in accidents associated with the first-time firearms owners taking the course. In 2002, 2003, he discovered a 20 to 30% increase in firearms accidents. And then he looked at the total firearms accidents across Canada. They were so low that 3 or 4 accidents resulted in a 20 to 30% increase. Now, you have to remember, in Canada, every time you fire a gun, that's the use of a firearm. Now, taking it out of the cabinet and admiring it, like we're going to admire my 1917 over 100-year-old 455 Smith & Wesson 1917. It's not a triple lock. It's one of the later, less desirable models. But every time we take it out and use it, like in this show, that's a use of a firearm. But the Environment Canada has told us, and import data has told us that there's about 375 million cartridges imported into Canada every year. That's an incredible number of cartridges. Each one of those cartridges represents one use of a firearm. And when you take a look at the accident rate with firearms, 10 or 20 or 30 out of 375 million is so close to zero that it's unbelievable. When you take a look at the crimes and the number of firearms shot in criminal acts, the number of that, once again, the number of criminal acts where a firearm is used is approaching zero. Somebody is manipulating and managing the numbers to make all those 2 million gun owners look bad. And here's a reminder: there's probably another 2 million Canadians who are in possession of firearms who don't have a license. They're scofflaws, and the government can't find those guys. There's probably between 20 and 30 million guns in Canada. Only 14 million got put into the gun registry when the the gun registry was made mandatory in 1998, handguns had to be re-registered. Now, there were roughly 980,000 handguns in Canada, and if I recall correctly, less than 50% of those listed as possession of handguns with a registration certificate bothered to get a gun license. And all those handguns simply evaporated.
Yep. Jerrold, and there's a great point that you made there too. The more poignant point of what's going on now in the urban centers. We're seeing increase in armed criminal gang activity, and they're getting guns from someplace, right? So way back when Ralph Goodall came out and said that half of these guns were domestically sourced, and people were asking, well, where are you getting this data from, right? And they started digging around. He didn't offer anything up. Later on, there wasn't any data that was really around. He was just making up information. But there was some data in Toronto, right? They had done some empirical studies there. And what they found was that it was something like 70% of the guns that gangbangers were using in Toronto were actually foreign sourced, like usually from the United States. And the other 30% were something else. And I'm not going to say domestic, because when we broke down that 30%, some were stolen, but in there they had air guns, they had paintball guns, they had squirt guns. Okay, so like you said, they're manipulating the data, and the reason they're doing this is because this is not about public safety. This is not about crime control. This is about civil disarmament, and they're jigging the data to make it happen. So you know what? They're lying. They're just lying.
Charles, you make some very interesting points. But I'd like to remind everybody that those people in Toronto that are committing crimes with guns are 100% Canadian. They're 100% people. They make the choice to commit crimes, and they commit crimes with guns, knives, baseball bats, illicit substances that kill people like fentanyl. These are career criminals. They have a long history in the courts of criminal acts, some of which include violence. The gun laws are not stopping them from stealing or smuggling guns. Guns are totally irrelevant. Catch and release and farming criminals is the problem. We cannot look at a criminal and ask him not to commit crimes anymore.
The other thing is that all of this represents a failure of 50 years of gun control laws. The fact that every time there's a gun control law, they say, "Oh, if only we do this, it would stop these bad people from doing bad things." And it's simply not true. Bad people are always going to continue doing their bad things. They don't care about the laws. They're not interested in changing their behavior. They're going to find whatever tools, and firearms in that circumstance are another type of tool for their criminal activity. And they're just going to substitute something that will work for them. So when someone commits a crime with a firearm, that's a failure of gun control laws. That's what it is. When someone's freedom is impinged, that's a failure of gun control laws too. So these gun control laws simply don't serve the interests of the public. They don't serve the interests of the firearms owner, and they do not prevent criminal misuse of firearms for illicit purposes. They just don't.
And the premise of all those gun laws way back when was to enhance public safety. But when we challenged them, exactly what you just said, licensing doesn't stop an outlaw from getting a gun. Registration doesn't stop, an outlaw from using a gun, and reclassification doesn't stop an outlaw from, continuing his craft, using a gun, right? Those are, like you said, those are all failures, right? But they will not concede that the liberal gun control, and I use that term loosely because conservatives were involved in this as well too, is not crime control. This is something else, and we know what it is now. It's civil disarmament. They want to disarm Canadians, just like they did the UK. And like you said, Sheldon, there's places out there that have been disarmed, and there's a substitution effect. If you can't get a gun, you get a knife, you get a baseball bat. Crime keeps on going. There's that sector of people out there who are immoral, who are evil, who will try to do things to harm people for personal gain, whatever it may be. And they're out there. It's not the gun, it's not the knife, it's not the gasoline, it's not the rented van, it's the person.
Well, and the other thing is, people ask, and I see in the comments, who's ready to give up their guns? I don't think Canadians are ready to give up their guns. Not any of them, regardless of what kind of legislation the Liberals or their ilk bring down. People aren't giving up their guns. It's at the point now where we've seen successive gun grab after successive gun grab, devaluation of people's long cherished property going back for 40 or 50 years. Property that people were looking at for their retirements or for investment purposes, and all of a sudden that's worth nothing, and they can't sell it or do anything with it because there's nobody able to buy it. I know of many cases where people have very historical firearms that they're simply not allowed to sell. They're not allowed to do anything with, because there's nobody but a very few select collectors who can buy these things. They can go donate it to a museum and maybe get a tax receipt, but they cannot get the money out of those things that they've invested in them. And it's not okay. It amounts to theft, and it isn't anything else. And no one should give up their guns. No one should give up any of their personal property to a draconian government engaged in this nefarious and ill-intentioned activity to take away your civil rights, your property, and just do bad things. I mean, we're seeing a society that's pretty messed up right now, and I can tell you they have motivations for trying to get our firearms from us, and they're not good.
Which brings us to the October 1st, 2020 order in council prohibiting firearms. Excuse me. Mr. Trudeau and his cabinet and the Privy Council decided that Canadians simply don't need certain guns based on how they look. And these are what the Americans and what everybody would call hunting firearms. They're in hunting calibers. They have all the characteristics, or they have some of the characteristics of military firearms, because they're well made, they're very accurate, and they lend themselves very well to hunting and target shooting. The Lee Enfield, the number 1 and the number 3 and the number 4 Lee Enfields and the number 5s are all military firearms. But after World War II, they became standard firearms for hunting in Canada. I have a Parker Hale that was sold by mail order, a beautiful 303 number 4 rifle. I also have a number 1 Parker Hale that is absolutely gorgeous. It looks just as good as the modern sporting rifles. It's just as accurate, and it's ex-military. It's a bolt-action rifle. In its day, it was an assault rifle, because in World War I, millions of people carried those over the trenches and died. So
I got to interrupt you there, Jerrold. It was never an assault rifle. It was never fully automatic. It was never used for that. It was certainly used to take enemy territory away from them, but that's not an assault rifle. We don't want to use those gun grabber terms, because that's a gun grabber term.
That's a made up word on this channel.
Yeah.
You mean my number 3 Martini Henry with the Wilkinson bayonet isn't an assault rifle?
No. It was a military firearm that was used to help take away territory and to defend soldiers doing their job. But it's not an assault.
We're involved at the UN level, and I've talked to the Canadian delegation a couple times about this definition of military-style assault rifles, right? So, and of course, we know that there is no legal definition to the term. It's a political civil disarmament term that's been made up by the gun grabbers out there. We know that. What's interesting is that the Canadian delegation that goes to the UN, to the ATT, and the POA, they recognize the distinction between a service rifle, like what you're talking about, like a Lee Enfield or something like that, or even an M4. Those are service rifles that are used by police and paramilitary, military, et cetera, et cetera. And they make the distinction from, a civilian carbine that looks like that, but is not the same, right? So unfortunately, the government is not, in tune with what they're actually pushing at the UN. So there's all this hypocrisy out there. People have to understand that, once again, they're being lied to by the liberals. They're just lying all the time, and they're trying to make it sound like truth. They're lies. Why would I actually believe
It's
anything?
propaganda to push a particular political agenda, Charles. I think you're dead right.
I'm going to do what Trudeau did next time. If I get caught in some kind of trumped up information or situation, I'm just going to apologize and say, you know what, I probably shouldn't have done that, and we'll see how that goes, and I'll go surfing.
Yeah, well, it just goes and shows you where the priorities of the leadership in this country are.
Well, Charles, if you apologize for possession of a prohibited firearm, can you keep it?
I'm not going there.
I don't think that I don't think you have to give up anything.
No,
my guns got lost in a boating accident.
Yeah,
So,
you know what? There is no will.
Maybe Trudeau,
surfing accident.
Maybe Trudeau will find him when he's surfing, right?
You know what? There is no will on behalf of the public out there. Certainly not the police to go door to door and smashing in things, taking guns from people. Nobody wants that kind of totalitarian behavior in our society. So in a democracy, civil resistance, up to including civil disobedience, is a legitimate thing to do when you are being persecuted by bad laws and bad governance. So, that doesn't make you a ideologically motivated violent extremist, as Pam Dalmouth would like to coin us. We are just exercising our democratic rights to say no. If we can't say no, we no longer live in a free country.
I think there's a lot of pressure to not have democratic rights. Is what's going on.
We see that. I get that, right?
When you look at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms today, and you look at things like mobility rights that apply to everyone, supposedly, you rights for to work and do whatever you want wherever you want to in Canada. Well, all of that stuff seems to be a little bit curtailed right now for at least some members of society. And when you start tying that to programs of taking on people's firearms and confiscating their property, I think we got a big problem in this country.
Huge problem. I mean, the Liberals demonstrated that with their OIC. What contempt for the parliamentary process of discussing things and coming out with some kind of a due process consensus. They just did a runaround and basically jammed it through and made it happen. That is not the Canada that we are supposed to be having here. It's something else. We have lots of our members out there who came from countries where they used to do that and they had to suck it up because, if you didn't, they come to your door with a gun and you would be made to obey. That is not Canada. And we will resist that kind of totalitarian, tyrannical behavior.
I heard from a firearms owner today, one of our field officers in Ontario, who's very, very concerned about all of this because his family tradition comes from exactly that, where their family fled from persecution in Eastern Europe. They came to Canada early on in the 20th century to avoid continued religious persecution. They put down their roots here. They became farmers. They became active contributors to Canadian society. And they came here to get away from all that nonsense. And what do we have now? Here we have that nonsense, a little over 100 years later. And it's not okay, and we cannot continue to accept it.
Sheldon, you're wrong. It's 50 years later.
Oh, yeah, well, you're right, Jerrold. There's been certain subsequent waves of this stuff. I was referring to the specific example that I was given, but you're right. There have been many waves where people have had to deal with these draconian regimes that persecuted people, and I would say it's not even 50 years.
In Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Italy in 1944, 45, when the Allies liberated Italy.
Rwanda.
There was immediate gun control. Rwanda.
Yugoslavia. Srebrenica.
Croatia. Yeah.
Yeah, there's many more recent examples that I can certainly concede your point, Jerrold, but it's not 50 years. It's not that long ago. If we get inclusive of that, it's going on today. persecution hasn't ended. And
So we know
it.
that the Liberals got back in, and we can just expect more of the same. If we know anything about the Liberals, especially Trudeau, is that he doesn't back down; he doubles down, right? So he will, Bill C-21 died on the order table. That will be resurrected, probably in a even stricter form to appease the the people that are actually they're beholden to. And there's Polly out there, and there's the docs. They are really controlling the language of the Liberals out there, and they have the audacity to accuse us of being like Americans. I mean, the doctors are actually foreign funded. They just received $300,000 from Airbnb. We don't know how that money was channeled to them. God knows how it came through, but they're a foreign funded anti-gun organization working here in Canada. Yeah. And we're supposed to respect that kind of thing? I don't think
Absolutely so. Not.
You mentioned they don't want American style gun laws in Canada. Now would be a good point in time to point out that the assault weapons ban that the Order in Council is sort of a mirror of the assault weapons ban in the USA. You have to remember that the anti-gun, get rid of firearms movement started in the USA in the 50s. The catalyst in the USA that gave it wheels and power was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963.
And Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Bobby Kennedy.
Yes.
And also the Charles Whitman Dallas Clock Tower event, along with the Vietnam War and watching war on TV every night, all served as catalysts for the Gun Control Act of 1968.
And then in 1968, Canada, in order to harmonize their gun laws with the U.S., passed a gun law that wasn't even anywhere near harmonizing with the U.S. What they did was they prohibited certain firearms that were legally held by individuals, and that's the full auto machine guns held by collectors. And there was no crimes associated with that. These guys weren't out committing crimes. In fact, full auto firearms, the ones they prohibited at that time, would have been too large, too bulky, and the weight of the ammunition alone would have required a crew of criminals to carry the things. Mm-hmm. But they got banned because it sounded good, and very few people had them. With the firearms prohibition, the 12-6 of 1995, they calculated how many restricted handguns could they ban without losing too many votes. It was an entirely political process.
Yep.
A fellow by the name of John Dixon, who was part of that, came out and told us exactly why they chose the criteria to ban those handguns.
They wanted to out Kim Campbell.
Yeah, they wanted to out the conservatives. And the problem we have is a bureaucracy that wants to ban firearms in Canada. And the Liberal Party, according to a fellow named Patterson, who wrote a book called The Patriot Game, the Liberal Party is the political arm of the Canadian bureaucracy. There's a number of prime ministers have a history in the Canadian bureaucracy. Mackenzie King and Lester B. Pearson. They were all bureaucrats before they became politicians. A number of NDP MPs were bureaucrats before they became politicians. And they have, a lot of these bureaucrats, when Margaret Thatcher cleaned out the bureaucracy in England and in the United Kingdom, a lot of those bureaucrats fled England and brought their anti-gun ideas to Canada. And they've been promoting them on the nickel of gun owners. They've been going into the offices of members of parliament and saying, we need gun control. We need to get rid of guns in Canada. Well, why? Well, because guns are dangerous. And there's possibly 20 million guns in Canada. We know that through the registry, there were 7 million guns registered. We know there's 2.2 million gun owners who aren't committing crimes with firearms, yet they're the focus. They're the diversion that the politicians are using for the high crime rate in Toronto. They're saying, oh, we have criminals in Toronto on the streets using firearms to harm other people. Let's go after the criminals in Quebec, or let's go after the gun owners in Quebec, the Maritimes, the Prairie provinces, and let's punish those guys. And any kindergarten teacher knows that when you punish the wrong people, you build resentment from the people you punish. If you punish an innocent person, that is morally wrong. That goes back to Blackstone and wrongful conviction.
Yeah, it sure does.
If the benefit, if you know, you can't convict a person if they haven't committed a crime. And possession of property is not a crime, and that's where the abuse of the criminal code has come in.
Well, it's bullying, Jerrold, is what this really is.
It's bullying and harassment.
Yeah.
You go to the chief firearms officer, you say, may I take my gun here? May I take my gun here for a legitimate legal purpose? And then a government bureaucrat says, oh, well, you have to meet these standards and you have to go to, and we don't trust you with guns. We trust you driving a car. We trust doctors with lethal drugs, with addictive drugs. We trust doctors to take people and cut them wide open and remove parts of their bodies for organ transplants and literally do a rebuild. But we don't trust you because you're a gun owner.
Right.
See a gun, call 911. It's really bad.
It's terrible. But we should probably talk about a couple of other things. I just wanted to report a bit on our efforts with KKS Tactical and the OIC challenge. We're looking at seeing an extension, probably either granted by the judge or by the government, with regards to the deadlines on that, and we're hoping that that's what's going to happen. We're still working towards making sure that that case is well supported with its narrow focus. We're very much in favor of the narrow focus on the key issue. We're not taking a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach. That's an approach that's very, very risky and more likely to cause a problem with the court than a narrowly focused issue that's much more easy to consider and rule on. And it's also very dangerous to bring up issues that have been sorted out before, expecting that they might somehow be overthrown, because what ends up happening instead is since they're not a focused issue, they'll be reinforced and made stronger by the court. And I think it's been a pretty risky, as some of the other parties in this OIC challenge are doing. It's a very risky thing that could cause a lot of damage to the key element of the case, which is, are these firearms reasonable for hunting and sporting purposes in Canada, and is the Governor and Council flawed when that was considered? So, that's the key issue. That's what we got to focus on if we're going to win this case, not on a whole bunch of flashy stuff with constitutional challenges and other nonsense like that is simply not going to fly. So we're still working hard on that. We're still, of course, collecting donations to help support our court activities. And, people are welcome to help contribute at NFA.ca. Please do it today. Charles, you probably wanted to talk about the Mass Casualty Commission briefly before we close. And then I guess that's probably good.
Yes. So for people who don't know, I mean, there was the mass murder that happened last year. And of course, there was the knee-jerk reaction by Trudeau with the OIC to ban all the guns to prevent that kind of thing from happening again in the future. Of course, we know that that's all nonsense. So they put together a mass casualty commission in Nova Scotia. With the NFA, we got into the process as official participants now. I've been basically at all the meetings, and we're up to date here now. I just want to let everybody know that I know they're trying to make the venue in Truro or near Portapique so that they could have the people not travel too far from the place where that's really affected, but that's not really happening. They're having the hearings now at the Halifax Convention Center, and that is coming up on the 26th of this month. So there's going to be 3 days of hearings. There's going to be some committee work after the fact. This phase of the Mass Casualty Commission is going to be focusing on what happened at this point. We are lining up probably for the second phase, where there's going to be more focus on why it happened. We've lined up some expert witnesses. We have Dr. Langman, Dr. Lott, and we have Gary Mauser. And Gary Mauser as well too, as our expert witnesses to go in there. I don't think they'll be talking at this phase, but they will certainly be hopefully called for the second phase of this to bring that in. So we'll keep you up to date as to what's going on with that. And like I said, we're right in there. So stay tuned.
Very good.
All right. Well, I mean, we've gone on for 45 minutes. I think we'll leave it at that for tonight. Jerrold, it was great having you on the show for the first time. We hope that you're going to want to jump on again. And thank you everybody for coming out and watching us tonight.
All the best.
Thank you for inviting me. And
all right, guys, take care.
All right.
Take care.
Take it easy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of NFA Talk. Like and follow the NFA on social media and sign up to become a member.